It's the middle of winter. You're wrapped in a thick blanket, the heater humming quietly in the corner, and you still reach over to turn the temperature up 1 more degree. Now imagine that same night, stripped of everything you rely on. No blanket, no heater, no walls, no roof over your head. Just you standing in the open cold, with the wind pushing through everything you're wearing, and no way to escape it until morning. That was simply Tuesday for your ancestors. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived through freezing nights, brutal winters, and entire ice ages without a single blanket, without central heating, without anything close to what keeps you warm tonight. They didn't just endure it. They spread across some of the coldest, harshest places on Earth, places where a single mistake could mean freezing to death before sunrise. So how did they do it? How did a soft-skinned, fur-less animal manage to outlast the ice? The answer doesn't come from one clever trick. It comes from a long chain of small, hard-won discoveries, each one built carefully on top of the last, tested against real winters, refined by people who had no room for error. Let's start at the very beginning with the first tool that made any of it possible. Fire. Not fire as a spark that flared up and vanished. Fire as something ancient humans learned to control, protect, and keep alive night after night, season after season. Evolutionary anthropologist Wrangham has spent years studying how the mastery of fire changed the course of human history. Once early humans learned to keep a flame burning through the darkest hours, everything around them shifted. Fire wasn't just light pushing back the night. It was warmth you could sit beside. It was a barrier against predators circling just beyond the glow. It let people stay awake a little longer, talk a little longer, plan for tomorrow instead of simply surviving until it arrived. In many ways, fire was the very first blanket humanity ever owned, except this one had to be fed, watched, and protected by someone at all times, every single night, without exception. Picture it for a moment. A small group huddled close together, faces lit orange, the cold pressing in from every direction just a few feet beyond the light. Someone feeding small branches into the flame, careful not to smother it. Someone else half asleep, leaning into the person beside them for warmth. A child tucked between two adults, as close to the fire as safety allows. Outside that circle, the world is silent, dark, and freezing. Inside it, for a few hours at least, it's almost peaceful. But keeping a fire alive was never guaranteed. Wind could scatter it. Rain could drown it. A fire that went out in the middle of a freezing night, far from any way to relight it quickly, could turn a difficult evening into a fatal one. So fire wasn't just a comfort. It was a responsibility carried by the entire group, night after night, for generations. Before a fire could even be kept alive, it first had to be created, and that alone was no small task. Without matches, without anything close to a lighter, early humans relied on friction and sparks. Spinning a dry wooden stick fast against a wooden base until the friction produced enough heat to spark an ember. Striking certain stones together to throw sparks onto dry moss or bark, carefully cupped and blown into a flame. It could take minutes of steady, practiced effort just to coax the first thread of smoke, and everyone in the group understood exactly how precious that small curl of smoke really was. And fire alone still couldn't carry humans through an entire ice age. A fire only warms you while you sit beside it. The moment you stand up, walk, hunt, or travel across open, frozen ground, the cold finds you again immediately. Early humans needed something more personal. Something that traveled with them, wrapped around their bodies wherever they went. They needed clothing. Real clothing. Not just a loose hide thrown over the shoulders and hoped for. Not a needle like the one sitting in a sewing kit today. A thin, carved sliver of bone or ivory, patiently shaped by hand over hours, with a tiny hole pierced through one end. It sounds almost too simple to matter. But it was revolutionary. With a needle, animal hides could finally be shaped. Fitted. Sewn into sleeves, hoods, and tight seams that trapped body heat instead of letting the wind rush straight through every gap. This was no longer just a hide thrown over the shoulders. This was engineering, built layer by layer, stitch, by hands working in freezing temperatures to create something that could mean the difference between life and death. Ask yourself this. Why would anyone spend hours carving a needle from bone, then hours more sewing fur into fitted shapes, unless the cold genuinely demanded it? They had no other choice. So they adapted, piece by piece, generation by generation. Layers became the strategy. An inner layer, worn close to the skin to trap body heat against the body. An outer layer built to block wind, snow, and rain from ever reaching that warmth. Fur turned inward for insulation in some designs, or outward depending on the climate and the animal it came from. Feet were wrapped and bound separately, since frozen feet could end a hunt or a life faster than almost anything else. Hands were covered too, often with simple fitted mittens rather than separated fingers, since keeping fingers together conserved far more warmth. None of this was guesswork thrown together overnight. Across many generations, small improvements were tested against real winters, refined by trial, by loss, and by careful observation, then passed down to the next group who would need them just as badly. Archaeologists studying Ice Age sites across Siberia and the Arctic have found something remarkable. At a burial site known as Sungur in present-day Russia, thousands of small ivory beads were discovered arranged in careful rows across ancient skeletons, exactly the pattern you'd expect if they had been sewn directly onto fitted clothing, along the arms, across the chest, down the legs. The clothing itself decayed away thousands of years ago. But the beads stayed, frozen in place, quietly outlining the shape of garments complex enough to rival some modern winter gear, made entirely from bone tools, sinew thread, and patience. Some researchers have even pointed to this as one explanation for why certain groups of ancient humans pushed further into freezing northern territories than others ever managed. It wasn't always about being tougher or stronger or better hunters. Sometimes it came down to something as specific as who had figured out how to sew a hood that actually sealed out the wind. But clothing and fire still weren't the whole story. There was one more layer of protection, and it didn't come from animals or flames at all. It came from shelter. Long before permanent houses, ancient humans built shelter from whatever the land offered. Caves provided natural insulation, blocking wind and holding in warmth far better than open ground ever could, which is exactly why so many ancient hearths, tools, and bones are found deep inside them today. Where caves weren't available, humans built their own, using branches, packed earth, and animal hide stretched tightly over a frame to form small, low shelters designed to trap heat and block wind. Some groups dug shallow pits directly into the ground itself, using the earth as insulation, since soil holds warmth far better than open air, and lined those pits with dry grass, moss, or leaves to soften the cold ground beneath them and add one more layer between the body and the frozen earth. Every gap mattered. Every draft was an enemy. A shelter with even a small opening could lose heat fast enough to matter by morning, so entrances were kept low and narrow, sometimes covered with a hide flap that could be pulled shut from the inside. Some groups even positioned their shelters carefully against natural windbreaks, tucked behind ridges or large rocks, using the landscape itself as one more line of defense against the cold. And it came from each other. Ancient humans slept close together, often in small, tightly packed groups, inside these caves and shelters. Body heat, shared between several people in a small enclosed space, is a remarkably effective source of warmth, more effective in many cases than anything else available to them. Shared warmth, shared shelter, shared survival. There's something powerful in that image. Not one person fighting the cold alone through the night, but an entire group, breathing together in the dark, keeping each other alive simply by staying close, taking turns feeding the fire, listening to the wind outside. There was also danger in getting any of this wrong, and ancient humans understood that danger intimately because they lived beside it every single winter. A body losing heat faster than it can replace it slips slowly into a dangerous state, the mind growing foggy, the limbs growing clumsy, judgment fading before the person even realizes anything is wrong. This is what modern science calls hypothermia, and it doesn't announce itself loudly. It creeps in quietly, which made it one of the most feared threats of the cold season. A hunter caught too far from shelter as night fell. A traveler misjudging how quickly the temperature would drop once the sun disappeared. This is precisely why every layer of protection mattered so much, and why no single solution was ever trusted alone. Fire could fail. Clothing could tear. Shelter could be too far away when it was needed most. Survival depended on all of it working together all of the time with almost no margin for a bad decision. Seasonal movement became part of the strategy too. As winter approached, many groups didn't simply stay in one place and wait for the cold to arrive. They moved deliberately toward locations that offered better protection. Valleys that blocked the worst of the wind. South-facing slopes that caught a little more sun through the short winter days. Areas near reliable water that hadn't yet frozen solid. Choosing where to spend the coldest months was its own kind of survival skill, built from careful observation of the land across many previous winters, and passed down the same way everything else was, through memory and example rather than any written record. Here's the part that might genuinely surprise you. The cold didn't only threaten early humans. In a strange way, it helped shape them. The demands of freezing climates pushed the invention of the needle. The needle led to fitted, tailored clothing. Fitted clothing allowed humans to move into colder regions no one could have survived in before, following herds of animals further north than earlier groups ever dared travel. Each freezing night became a quiet kind of pressure, and out of that pressure came new tools, new skills, new ways of building shelter, new ways of living and working together, spreading further and further into parts of the world that once seemed completely impossible to settle. Difficulty didn't stop them. It shaped them tool by tool, stitch by stitch, fire by fire, one freezing night at a time. And none of this knowledge was written down anywhere. There were no manuals, no instructions passed along on paper. Everything from how to cut a hide to how to shape a needle to where to dig a shelter into the earth had to be taught directly, hand to hand, voice to ear, from one generation to the next. A child would watch an elder scrape a hide clean for hours, watch the careful way the needle passed through the leather, watch exactly how the fire was built and fed and protected from the wind. A skill lost was a skill that might cost lives the following winter. So knowledge like this was treasured, protected, and passed down with a seriousness that's easy to forget today, sitting warm and comfortable, far removed from that pressure. There's also something worth noticing in how much cooperation all of this actually required. Sewing a single set of fitted winter clothing wasn't a quick task finished in an afternoon. Scraping a hide clean, softening it, cutting it, stitching it could take days of steady work. Someone had to hunt the animal in the first place. Someone had to process the hide. Someone had to carve the needle. Someone had to know exactly how to cut and shape the pieces so they would actually fit a moving, breathing body without restricting it. No single person carried all of that knowledge alone. It lived across the whole group, in different hands, different skills, different roles, all quietly depending on each other to make it through the season together. Think about how many freezing nights it must have taken to arrive at all of this. How many failed attempts at a needle that snapped in half? How many shelters that let the wind through anyway? How many fires that simply refused to catch? None of it came easily. All of it came from people who kept trying anyway because the alternative was unthinkable, and because somewhere ahead of them was a version of this knowledge good enough to protect the next generation a little better than the last one had been protected. So tonight, when you pull your blanket a little higher or reach over to nudge the thermostat up one more degree, think about what that same small moment of warmth once required. A fire that had to be carefully kept alive through the darkest hours, watched by someone even while the rest of the group slept. A hide that had to be shaped by hand, stitched together with a bone needle, fitted piece by piece to trap in every bit of heat. A shelter built by hands, not bought and assembled in an afternoon. Other people, sleeping close, sharing warmth simply to make it through until morning. None of that was convenience. It was survival, built one small decision at a time across thousands of freezing nights, by people who had no guarantee they would see the next one, and who passed everything they learned forward anyway so that someone eventually would. And every warm night you've ever taken for granted traces its roots back to that same freezing darkness your ancestors somehow made it through. They didn't have blankets. They built the very idea of warmth from nothing, out of fire, bone, fur, earth, and each other, and it's the reason you're here, warm and comfortable, to feel it tonight.